Okay, so let's just jump into it. We have unfortunately, this is a timely panel on climate change in South Asia. And we have 3 experts with us today. I think everyone in this room and everyone on the call realizes that the threats of climate change are upon us now. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this seemed perhaps an abstract problem that we'd be confronting in the future. But even though world temperatures, global temperatures have only increased by maybe 1.1 or so degrees since the pre-industrial period, we're seeing more and more of the extreme events. The heat wave in South Asia is the most salient at the moment, but it is far from alone. I mean, my understanding is that last month, April, was the hottest April on record in India in 122 years of records. We have, fortunately, it's been relatively low humidity, but we expect that I imagine that there'll be quite a few deaths as a result of this. This is not the new normal. The new normal is going to be worse because we continue to add pollutants to the atmosphere. This demonstrates the challenge that's in front of us as a global community to address the challenges, address the damages and the threats of climate change as they appear now, and also to take leadership in reducing emissions. Of course, the reasons we're having this climate change is because of emissions that came from the developing world burning fossil fuels as the world economy grew. So in the first instance, it's the responsibility of the developed world to reduce those emissions and take leadership in doing that. But even saying that, coal, my understanding is that coal generates approximately 2/3 of electricity in India. So there's important roles that developing countries and South Asia can take in terms of both providing reliable sources of power and in decarbonizing the power sector. So fortunately today we have a panel that is highly expert in all of these issues. And we're going to start with Professor Mike McElroy. Mike is the Gilbert Butler Professor of Environmental Studies in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences and FAS, and in the Department of Environmental Science and Engineering in the Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. He has made enormous contributions across a range of scientific fields, including but not limited to climate science and power and energy science and policy. Mike heads up the Harvard-China Project on Energy, Economy, and the Environment. His work has expanded to include the energy system in South Asia and the potential policy challenges of decarbonizing India's power sector.
Okay, so as I said, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to what I think are some of the key issues involving climate and South Asian India in particular. So this is a summary of the key points in India's commitments on climate change at the Glasgow meeting. I mean, the first is to increase its non-fossil electricity energy generation to 500 gigawatts, which is pretty amazing, by 2030. Second is to meet 50% energy requirement from renewable energy by 2030, reduce the projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons by 2030, and reduce the carbon intensity of the economy by 45% relative to 2005, and finally, to achieve the objective of zero carbon emissions by 2030. So I think you'll see that that's a pretty ambitious challenge. Okay, I'm not going to try to work you through this, but it's a very, very nice picture produced by the IEA that shows how energy is used. So this is a complicated picture, but has a great deal of information on the energy system in 2019 in India, showing on the left-hand side, the primary energy sources: coal, natural gas, oil, nuclear, modern renewables, and traditional biomass. And if I could flip to the next slide, I guess I have to do that. This is a sort of a quick summary of what's actually on that first slide. Fossil sources accounted for 77% of primary energy in India in 2019. And modern renewables includes hydro, accounted for a little more than 10%. So you can see from that the enormous challenge that India faces if it's going to meet Prime Minister Modi's commitments for 2030, not to mention the commitment for 2070. And if you look at this next chart, this chart here is an interesting summary of carbon dioxide emissions in terms of the various contributions to that. The power sector, mostly from coal, is the largest source of CO2 emissions at 2019. Industry is significant, with iron and steel and cement playing a major role, as you would expect in a developing country. Transport relatively small compared to what it would be in Europe or in the United States, for example. And buildings relatively small, and other energy sources and agriculture are indicated here. So these are the CO2 emissions that are important in India. Now, if you think of some of the implications of climate change, increasingly extreme weather, floods and droughts. Okay, we've seen a great deal of history of that particular problem over the last number of years. Extreme temperatures, I mean, it was difficult to not hear about the high temperatures that India was suffering from in the last month, and I think up to present, temperatures which are, extreme in terms of human survival, indeed. Depletion of groundwater resources. I'm looking forward to hearing Anthony's talk on this, particularly. I think that depletion of groundwater reserves is a particular problem for the future and for the present. Salt buildup is another issue in soils, challenges for agriculture, and then deterioration of air quality. Air quality issues are a big problem in India, with implications for public health. Near-term challenges from the Indian perspective: need to alleviate poverty, especially in rural areas. I'm happy to have my colleague Prem Jha here. Prem and I are deep into working on a book on an overview of India's energy issues and social problems, and I've learned a lot talking to Prem about these issues. But need to alleviate poverty, especially in rural areas, is a very important thing. Need to provide jobs for a growing young population, again, very important. Unemployment rates are extremely high, and actually curiously high for educated people relative to people who just have elementary education. Need to reduce the dependence on imports of oil, natural gas, and coal. That has been enunciated by Prime Minister Modi as an important issue. And then the need to develop paths for sustainable development. If I think of the elements of a low carbon future, I believe that wind and solar are the important cornerstones for a low carbon energy future. And in fact, the wind and solar resources in China in India are more than enough to, in fact, meet India's demand if we do it the right way. But there are problems with renewables, as we all know. The variability, the wind doesn't blow all the time, seasonal dependence, and serious issues that have to be addressed. We see a very important role for green, so-called green hydrogen, and potentially also for green ammonia. Let me just say what that is. Green hydrogen is where you produce hydrogen by running a discharge through water. And in the process, you split the water molecule into oxygen, and pure hydrogen. And the alternative sources of hydrogen in modern societies involve, in the case of China, using coal as the source of energy to produce the hydrogen, and in most of the world, including the United States, using natural gas. And that's also true in India at the moment. India uses natural gas to produce hydrogen, to produce ammonia as nitrogen fertilizer for agriculture. The low carbon future, I believe, can address a large number of India's societal problems. We have time to talk about that a little bit. I mean, if we're going to build an infrastructure that has a significant concentration on wind and solar, that's going to be localized, and the opportunity is to provide jobs in rural areas for people who are currently rather poor, and in fact, short of jobs. I think that's an important issue. Need to identify paths for sustainable development. And then the final point I want to make here is that it's important for government policy that it should not be distracted to pursue measures that, while attractive in the short term, might be ineffective, even counter-effective for the long term. Let me sort of make a comment about that. Recently, the Indian government announced that a plan is to use coal as a source of gasification to produce liquid fuels that can be used in transportation substitution for oil and diesel. Okay, I don't think that's a very good idea for several reasons. Number one, the analysis doesn't consider the cost of doing that. Number two, it's an enormous source of CO2. And unless you are prepared to spend the effort to capture that CO2 and to bury it, then that's really not going to be very effective. So I'm conscious about the time here. We have a paper that just appeared actually that looked at the possibility of decarbonization for India in 2050. And the chart on the left is sort of what you might call business as usual, using fossil fuels, using the same source. The chart on the extreme right is one where we have, in fact, investigated the use of wind and solar, and particularly hydrogen, and the hydrogen used to accommodate for variability in the wind and solar, and the hydrogen also used as a substitute for coal in the iron and steel industry as a source of high temperature heat for cement. And the bottom line here is that we believe that it is possible. The cost on the left to do this is indicated here. And the cost to do this, to get to zero carbon, according to our analysis in 2050, is actually less than business as usual. And that gets you to zero CO2, as that dashed red line actually shows. Just to emphasize the magnitude of the problem, electricity demand in 2019 in India is 1,321 terawatt hours. Projected demand for 2050, assuming the ambitious growth potential, is 8,323. And then the hydrogen production at the moment is 4.4 megatons per year in 2019. And in this projection, we're going to a very large projected increase in the production of hydrogen to 136. So I just finish with that for people who want to look at more of these the papers that are underline this particular story. You can just click on this website and get them. So thank you, Jim. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for the organizers. Thank you.
Okay, that's terrific. Thanks so much, Mike, and we look forward to following up when we have the Q&A session. That's an awful lot of information, and it's really fascinating. The next presentation is from Sheila Jasanoff. Sheila is the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. A pioneer in her field, she has authored more than 130 articles and chapters and is an author or editor of more than 15 books. Her work explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracies. She founded and directs the program on science, technology, and society at Harvard. Her many prizes and recognitions include being the 2022 recipient of the Holberg Prize, dubbed the Nobel Prize for the Social Sciences and Humanities, for her prolific and pioneering work in the field of science and technology studies. Sheila?
So, in a sense, you can think of Mike and me bracketing the world of climate change and climate governance, because whereas Mike's attention appropriately for his field is fixed on the immaterial objects that bring about climate change and the other immaterial objects that you need to mobilize in order to deal with climate change, my attention as a social scientist is fixed much more on the dynamics of the people and the societies in which these changes will have to be implemented in some sense. So, I used to travel a lot before COVID, and maybe it's coming back, but the metaphor of the open jaw to anybody who travels a lot is sort of ingrained in one's mind. You land in one place, but you come back from another place. And even if it is Gatwick and Heathrow, the open jaw is a problem, and how you get from the one thing to the other is a real problem. I have a fairly simple message, which is that if you look at India from the standpoint of innovation in the material sector, it may look one way. But if you look at India from the standpoint of innovation in the moral and social sector, then maybe the message looks different. And that is the big open jaw, that I think the thinking about morality, justice, how societies respond to climate change has not kept pace with, or the thinking on the material side, I should say, has not kept outpace. This is an inversion of the usual lag argument. The usual lag argument is that we have technologically advanced societies and the technologically less advanced are not keeping up. I'm saying that we have perhaps morally more far-thinking societies, and they have not been necessarily kept up with in those terms, and I want to historicize a little bit to make that point. Well, so Jim has already spoken about the heat wave, but interestingly, this heat wave, I mean, people themselves are referring to the fact that Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future, tracks the heat wave. What strikes me, I tried to assign a chapter of that book to my environmental politics class in the fall and decided against it because it struck me as an immoral book, in a sense, because it starts out with a heat wave that kills 20 million people. But the 20 million people are in India, and they're nameless and faceless, and they're just 20 million, but they're people, right? I mean, so, you know, in a sense, this reminded me of the old population explosion arguments where people were looking at the global south as the source of problems because of the population explosion. And then, you know, I was a little bit taken aback to find this in the latest hate crime outburst in Buffalo, New York just the other day, that eco-fascism, which used to be applied to a kind of green extremism, now is being applied to a kind of right-wing extremism. And, you know, this is a quotation from the suspect, I think we're still supposed to call him, in the Buffalo massacre, that, you know, for too long we have allowed the left to co-opt the environmental movement, whereas the left has controlled all discussion regarding environmental preservation, whilst simultaneously presiding over the continued destruction of the natural environment. And this then is tied to migration, and it's tied to exactly the same population explosion concerns that dominated back in the 70s when people were talking about demography as a factor in climate change. So the wheel keeps spinning and we keep coming around, but this is the world in which we have to implement whatever the policy changes are. Many people, Indian writers and ecologists among them, have understood profoundly that we're talking about patterns of consumption that intersect with one another. So this is an extract from a book by Gilbert and Guha, who wrote one of the very first environmental history books about India, and they divided up people into categories depending on the nature of their relationship with the ecosystem around them. And they talked about the fact that many people in, you know, what is usually called the poverty sector are living in a way much more closely with their ecosystem. So we in Massachusetts and Cambridge have to invent a word like locavore, and we have to talk about locally sourced and so forth. But it's an invention down the road through a set of developments that has brought the problem of climate change upon us in the first place. But these ecosystem people that Gadgil and Guha wrote about in 1995 are already living that kind of, in a sense, sustainable world because they're depending on their particular environments. And, you know, when we talk about energy scenarios for one planet, I mean, you know, what are we talking about? Do we need to, I mean, that's an environmentalist friend of mine standing in North Wales near a nuclear power plant. I mean, do we have to go through that passage in order to get from the left, where anybody who knows South Asia recognizes the cow dung patties, which are extremely biosustainable in a sense, although they produce a lot of emissions when you burn them. But, you know, we're not talking about capturing those emissions. We're talking about first going to a level of consumption that then brings about the other energy scenarios whose waste products we still have not solved in some sense. So when I say India has been innovating in terms of thinking about justice, where it has not perhaps been innovating in the same way in the material technological sector, the first, you know, sort of warning call that this was going to be difficult because ideas of justice were frankly very difficult in the North and the South, or in developing countries or not, came from this book that was written in the very early 1990s by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan. Anil Agarwal was the founder of India's largest and most influential environmental NGO, the Center for Science and Environment, and Sunita Narayan is the current head of it, who is, you know, she's considered one of the most prominent voices speaking about the environment. But their move was, in a way, what people much later on down the line have called the Anthropocene. They were calling attention to the fact that carbon is intimately tied up with other forms of life. We are living carbon entities, right? And then we depend on carbon. And what that relationship is something that we need to take account of. And they therefore wanted to divide emissions into two categories: survival emissions, the emissions of the poor, necessary to even live, and luxury emissions, the emissions of the rich. Did the IPCC listen to that argument? No. Its policy committees and its, you know, even its sort of structure, which said first do the science, then do the impacts, and then do the policy, did not have any room in it for an inversion of the thought process, come from the way people live, and then go back to designing the world in a way that in some sense responds to that. So 10%, Mike, I mean, that was an interesting number about renewables, but the very last research project where I was able to travel in January of 2020, when a certain virus from Wuhan was just a sort of vague murmur in the press, was to this Pavagada solar park near Bangalore. And it's one of, I think it's the second largest solar park in India. But the reason I'm showing this to you is just to get a sense of material transitions in relation to human transitions. I mean, so this was literally as far as the eye could see. As a child brought up on Raj Kahini in Bengali in India, I knew about a story in which the Islamic invaders to Rajasthan come and park outside a Rajasthani fortress, and the woman Padmini, who has a major heroine in Indian mythology, looks out and says, "How did an ocean suddenly appear outside my door?" And I was reminded of that legend when I saw this, because it was like an ocean appearing, you know, where dry land had existed. But as we went around that area, we came to a nearby village, and the villagers talked to my friend who runs an NGO out of Bangalore and said, "What have you done to us?" I mean, they took him as responsible for the solar park, and they said that there is no livelihood here anymore, that our kids, if they want work, have to travel to Bangalore. There is no transportation. I mean, basically, subsistence farming was a form of life, and it has been displaced by no form of life. So, you know, the sort of what is the sustainable future when you look at it from the standpoint of the people is a different thing from, you know, what it was before. So, you know, it's not for nothing that when you get up to international negotiations like COP26, there are India and China diluting the language. But I am a lawyer by training, and I think about language. I also have a background in historical linguistics, so that's another reason why I think about language. And what does that dilution mean? I mean, it is not an intransigent standing up for coal. I mean, nobody, you know, other than inside the United States, thinks that one should not do something in the face of climate change. It's a question of what is possible. And my view is that the imaginations of the cycle you need to go through in order to get out at the other end ignore extraordinarily significant form of life changes on the ground, anthropological, sociological transformations that are not built into the bare words energy transition. And until we get those open doors together again, I don't think that we are going to get very far. This is my favorite quotation from Our Common Future. They went around and held regional meetings, and one person from Brazil told the Brundtland Commission, "You talk very little about life, you talk too much about survival." And what are they pointing at? That life is down on the ground the way we live it from day to day. Survival is a population-wide, temporarily displaced idea that may make sense to science with its models and scenarios, but doesn't make sense in terms of what the present demands and what is then our common future if we cannot unite life and survival into the same picture. Has India tried to do this? Yeah, I mean, with things like the Chip Go movement. And I'll just finish by saying that, one should look at societies as sites of not just methodological and material innovation, but also epistemic and social innovation. And that is the integration that we need to come back to. I'm sorry, this is barely legible even to me, but I'm happy to have these slides posted. And I think one can look at the ways in which living societies have been thought in these countries and where the frictions are in trying to bring nature and culture together in the ways they will have to be brought together if we are to have transition for a sustainable world. So with that, let me hand the microphone over.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. The next panelist is Anthony Acciavatti. I knew I'd get this wrong. Acciavatti, the Daniel Rose Assistant Visiting Professor at Yale School of Architecture. He works in the intersection of architecture and the history of science and technology. His scholarly interests include the histories of environmental sciences along with the landscape architecture and engineering since the 18th century, including cartography, agriculture, anthropology, and ecology. His 2015 book, Ganges Water Machine, Designing New India's Ancient River, is an atlas of the enterprise to transform the Ganges into the most hyper-engineered landscape in the world. Anthony?
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Hitesh, for the invitation. It's great to be with all of you here today. Is this good to go with the slides? If we could put it in full mode, that'd be great. Thanks. So today I'd like to speak about the virtues of seeing like a mudskipper, which is pictured here. These beautiful amphibious fish can live on land for days on end, and these fish that live on land easily move between wet and dry, hard and soft conditions. Indeed, they are mud-loving creatures that have inspired my working in the Ganga River Basin for the past 17 years. They not only move between wet and dry with ease, but they have also evolved so that when they are above water, they see clearly like human beings, whereas when we submerge ourselves, our vision becomes wavy due to how water refracts light different than air. Mudskippers continue to see clearly and can see long distances. This kind of double vision, I would say, can teach us a lot about how to not only reckon climate change, but also incorporate environmental uncertainty in our work as stewards of the built environment. And hopefully they can assist in seeing beyond dichotomies like hard and soft, water and land, wet and dry, nature and culture, as Sheila was just mentioning. I spent a better part of a decade seeing like a mudskipper to create a dynamic atlas of the world's most densely populated and hyper-engineered river basin, Ganga. Rather than try to shoehorn the fieldwork and archival research into a short talk like today, which is a book and exhibition titled Ganges Water Machine, I will share with you some mud-loving moments that epitomize the virtues of seeing like a mudskipper. Seeing like a mudskipper means attending to this substance, silt. Ever since the subcontinent collided with Asia 50 million years ago, trillions upon trillions of tons of silt and sediment have been shed from the ever-growing Himalayas during the tempestuous firewater cocktail that we call the monsoons. This silt and sediment are what makes the basin rich for agriculture, and its choreography rewards scrutiny. Indeed, today, between 1 and 1.6 billion tons of silt are shed annually from the Himalayas and across the Gangetic Plains. Now, let me take you to a city in the center of the Ganga River Basin that I've been drawing and visiting for the past 17 years, Prayagraj, or also known as Allahabad. Located at the confluence of the Ganga and Jamuna rivers, these drawings combine cartography and photography to capture the cyclical rhythms of the monsoons over the course of a single year. What do I mean by What do I mean by these kinds of changes, these cyclical rhythms, these deep rhythms? is that this drawing shows how surface water bodies like riverbeds and lakes and ponds expand and contract over the course of a single year due to the monsoons. Observing these slow motion changes are crucial to understanding urban form and urban life of the city and its environs. Next slide, please. Throughout 2005 and 6, I visited the confluence of these two rivers at least once every 2 weeks, where I snapped photos like you see here to create a kind of panorama of the way the area goes from arid and dry to wet and gelatinous silt. These panoramas, as I'll show you in just a moment, complement the slow motion changes I was documenting cartographically. They show a different on-the-ground perspective. This is a panorama taken during Magh Mela, an annual religious festival that takes place at the confluence every January and February, where a temporary city is constructed on the banks and sandbars of the two rivers. It is full of tents, it has electricity and running water. Between 2 and 3 million people pass through the tent city every 45 days. Next slide. Once the festival ends, the outline of the gridded city remains on the ground, and farmers move in to sow their crops. In other words, the banks and sandbars are transformed from this hyper-dense urban community to agrarian spaces in less than 2 weeks. Next slide. Farmers harvest their crops. Next slide. The monsoons arrive, eroding the sandbars and shores. Next slide. And completely washes away the ground. This process of urban to agrarian repeats every year. Next slide. This combination of cartography and photography captures these slow motion changes and the way in which people build on the deep rhythms of the monsoons. Next slide. And of course, this is also the site of the Kumbh Mela, often spoken about as the largest gathering of humanity on the planet, where between 80 and 100 million people pass through this area over the course of 45 days. Next slide. But what I would say is, what is most spectacular to me is that this space goes from this tent city that you see here, next slide, to this agrarian space in 2 weeks' time. Next slide. No, sorry, there we go. As you can see here, the footprints of the tents and avenues remain tattooed on the sandbars. It is a drawing at the scale of the territory. This is the most intelligent use of space I have ever witnessed in my life, because these these processes provides a blueprint for how to build on these deep rhythms of the monsoons, a process that more and more parts of the world would benefit from with climate change and greater environmental uncertainty. Next slide. And seeing like a mudskipper led me to making my own prosthetics and instruments to visualize the dynamism of the basin. Because it had not been mapped in half a century, I had no choice but to develop guerrilla tactics to measure these changes through devices like the surface accumulation sleeve that you see here, a prosthetic that one wears over their right arm to map soils. It is equipped with a GPS unit as well as rolls of packaging tape, so that just as Spider-Man shoots his web from his wrist, I shoot packaging tape from my arm to collect soils. Next slide. The imprint left in the soil shown here is me shooting 1 kilometer of packaging tape perpendicular to the river channel to collect soils. Next slide. Here you can see the instrument exhibited in Seoul, South Korea in the 2019 biennial there. Next slide. And here a diorama capturing how the prosthetic works. Next slide. And along with being like Spider-Man's web, the packaging tape acts very much like the magnetic orb one uses in Takahashi's 2004 game Katamari Damacy that you see here, where small objects like spoons and paper clips adhere, and as more objects stick to the orb, next slide, it grows with jungle gyms and cars, next slide, snowballing to the point that it collects stadiums and entire city blocks, next slide. My strands of tape collect soils, but also flowers, fecal matter, plastics, auto parts, and more. These artifacts from human and non-human occupation allow me to conduct an ethnography of the soil. Using the wrong thing for the right purpose defines my work in mapping the Ganga. Next slide. And like a mudskipper, these devices, next slide, allow a user to move back and forth between fieldwork and lab work, like this diorama captures. Next slide. After scanning many kilometers of tape, I didn't have any instruments to map or analyze these soils. Next slide. So I turned to that trusted Photoshop tool in Adobe Suites known as the Magic Wand. Next slide. Which might be used like this when one wants to digitally place a tattoo on someone's chest. Next slide. But I misused the Magic Wand to break down particle sizes. Using the wrong thing for the right purpose allows me to make my own remote sensing device when no data is available. Next slide. And I use these techniques of using the wrong thing for the right purpose to make drawings of Prayagraj, but also transects like these across the basin to render the dynamism of it. I like to think of these drawings in terms of fashion. If most cartographic drawings are like Couture by Givenchy or Dior, where the measurements are customized, my drawings are more like ready-to-wear from H&M and Uniqlo, as they have what in fashion is called a seam allowance, so that if you gain a few pounds or lose a few pounds, they still fit. But I would say that as more and more of the world faces environmental uncertainty and the effects of climate change, models of adaptation like those in the Ganga Basin should goad us to use our skills to both read the world and project the world. Otherwise, we are likely to suffer the consequences of sight without the benefits of insight. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So we have, we're going to go about 10 minutes over, so relative to the original schedule, and end in about 15 minutes or so at 10:40. Our floor is open for questions. Or Tarun, do we have any questions coming from online? Oh yeah, please. Yeah.
Oh, hi. I was interested in hearing.
Let's see. Oh, let's see if we can. I think I need to do the roving mic bit here.
Hi. Thank you very much for your presentations. Professor McElroy, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the green hydrogen technology. And on your slide, you projected that it would be almost 30% of India's energy consumption in 2050. I wanted to ask if you felt that was a realistic number, and maybe you could just explain the technology a little bit more.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So the idea at the moment is that hydrogen is produced from natural gas, as I mentioned, with associated release of CO2. And that hydrogen is used to produce notably ammonia, which is the ingredient for chemical fertilizer. It's also used in the refining business. And so what we're contemplating here is the opportunity to take advantage of the variability of wind and solar to produce hydrogen from what's called electrolysis. And that's a well-established process. And the first study we did on this was actually looking at the production of, that's called green hydrogen. It's got no CO2 emission with it. So the first study we did was actually looking at the potential for green hydrogen in Western Inner Mongolia. And the conclusion that we reached was, in fact, you could produce green hydrogen in Western Inner Mongolia that would be effectively cheaper than the source from coal without the CO2 emissions that go with it. And in that particular study, what we were doing was actually taking advantage of times when the wind was blowing but not producing electricity because of the mismatch between power production and the need to keep people warm in winter. So we then did a study that Japan has a policy, a future policy, that hydrogen is going to be the major energy source for the future Japanese economy, but most of that hydrogen is going to be imported from as far away as Australia. So we did a study looking at the opportunity to produce green hydrogen from offshore wind in China and delivering it to Japan. In the India context, the first thing you'd want to do, obviously, would be to eliminate the current fossil sources of hydrogen. And I gave you a number for that. But then the next level is to use that hydrogen opportunity to replace coal and the use of coal in iron and steel and in cement. And our view is that, in fact, from an economic point of view, you can do that economically viably. It's a competitive way of using energy. And the idea of hydrogen is sort of becoming sort of global in some sense. Europe is talking about a major transition to a major hydrogen economy. Other parts of the world, including China, major hydrogen economy. And I believe that for India, it's a clean source of energy and potentially also a way of replacing current imports of coal, oil, and natural gas by exports of hydrogen and ammonia made from hydrogen. I hope that answers your question.
If I could just follow up on that and engage Sheila with a question. So you presented some moving slides of the large solar array displacing traditional agricultural practices. Now, the first thing that came to mind for me was thinking about distributed energy resources and how that could accommodate both of those. But if we think about something like green hydrogen, which would need to be produced at an industrial scale, then that raises these land use challenges. What sort of mechanisms would you think, Sheila? I mean, what reactions do you have? What sort of mechanisms would you have to make sure that, or to think about the ways that those industrial scale green hydrogen, other sorts of green solar generation technologies could be used in a way that supports local communities?
Well, thanks, Jim. I mean, so since 1969, with the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act in the US, there's been a commitment to the idea that if you're going to affect the environment in a deep and thoroughgoing way, you need to have consultation with people and an impact assessment of some sort. So, you know, even those sort of quite basic measures that have been with us for 50 years are far from being implemented worldwide. So that would be a kind of formalistic response. I mean, let's get serious about looking at alternatives and looking at consequences. I think we have enough stories in the world, whether it's high dams or totally engineered rivers or the automobile, to know that scale goes with problems down the line. I mean, that is, the micro problems arise inside of these scalar shifts, regardless what kind of things they are. A more important or basic point, though, is that how does the world look if you fashion the starting question in terms of the social rather than the material? So if you say, okay, there are these people, they're extremely poor, but from a carbon footprint point of view, these are the sustainable people. So then poverty alleviation might become not a matter of how do we get them in sort of a Bill Gates imagination, you know, to do the sort of energy, you know, standardization in terms of something that looks like first world consumption patterns, but how could one keep them equally sustainable and not in, quote, grinding poverty, unquote? I mean, that puts the challenge in a different way. I mean, then you would begin with possibly agriculture. These large land use things in India have led to the biggest, you know, changes in global thinking that I know of. I mean, so the Narmada River Basin project led to a series of upheavals that didn't ultimately deter the thing, but it certainly caused the World Bank for the first time to introduce environmental assessments into its thinking and then ultimately to withdraw from the project. But it's not obvious that withdrawing from the project was the right thing. I mean, the right thing would have been possibly to see what should happen with those displaced populations. So I think that it's easy to say and extremely difficult to imagine how the world looks if you start with the problems of the poor and think how to make those problems less, as opposed to starting with the lifestyles of the rich and think how problematic the world will be if other people are brought up to that level. That profound rethinking, I think, is a moral, political, ethical challenge. And I was wondering whether, Anthony, your ways of accounting ethnographically for soil, which I thought was a lovely phrase, would give us, in some sense, the micro footprints of what would need to happen if one were to get serious and, you know, look at, I mean, what you were describing was an extremely rapid transition between a natural ecosystem and a human-made one, but alternating season by season. I mean, I think that there's room for, you know, sort of rethinking the nature-culture imagination around scenarios like that, but I think you would have to sit in the same room as the people who are doing the hydrogen transition and people like me who are wondering about law and policy and institutions and how they fit together.
Well, and I think that goes quite well with what you shared with us from Bangalore with respect to the kind of just single land use of solar production of energy, because I think that one of the really fantastic and amazing things about what happens at the Sangam in Allahabad or Prayagraj is the way in which time gets incorporated and temporality. And so it's a kind of co-authoring of space because people are drawing the lines, that the sandbars are different every year. The farming practices change as well. So I think that kind of light, agile footprint is such an intelligent way to do climate adaptation and deal with environmental uncertainty as opposed to a kind of one-size-fits-all. And I certainly would welcome the opportunity to be in a room with the hydrocarbonists, the policymakers, and everyone else as well. So, thank you.
We have an online question, I understand.
If you can hear me, you should be able to
Butler
speak now.
From Pakistan. I've been listening to the discussion here and I'm a bit confused. I can understand the pollution that we have in Lahore or in Delhi. We ourselves are responsible for that because of, smoke coming out of the vehicles or burning of rice stubs in the field. But climate change that we are talking about, are we responsible for the high temperatures that we have, or is it we are suffering because of the sins committed by the developed countries, and they inflict this high temperatures on us for which we have no control. And not only is it suffering of the human body, but I can tell you this year, the crop yields of cotton, of maize and wheat in Pakistan have gone down by 20% as a result of the temperatures being abnormal during April and May. So is there any thought or any discussion or any information whether we in India and Pakistan are responsible for what we are suffering as a result of climate change, or is it because of people in Europe and America living, living well, and we are suffering as a result of what they are throwing into the environment?
And the short answer is the thinking is there. The implementation of responsibility changes. That is acknowledging responsibility and working on it. That is an extremely slow and long drawn out process. I'll just give you an analogy. Just at Harvard, we have recently had a report completed on the legacy of slavery in this institution's history and a commitment of a very large amount of money to doing the reparations. Compared with Harvard's involvement in the legacy of slavery, the impact of industrial development and colonialism on other parts of the world, is orders of magnitude different. But it has taken many, thoroughgoing social changes in order to bring about any form of acknowledgement on the part of, my institution. And, one could also look at the sort of politics of that report. How much were we all engaged in it? And, is it a democratic report from the standpoint of this institution? Even then one would have to acknowledge that the acknowledgement itself may not be the ideal way to go about doing this. So we have work ahead of us, and I guess my main point over and over is that work has to combine the kind of thing that Mike McElroy does and people in our science departments do with equally important work in both the humanities and the social sciences. I think people understand the economics part of it far better than they understand the sort of on-the-ground footprint stuff that maybe Anthony and I are more concerned about.
Could I just add to the question? The short answer is that India is not directly responsible for the warming that is suffering. The warming is, in fact, the result of past emissions of carbon dioxide from developed countries, and it's the total emission over time that actually affects the current climate. So if you were to assign on a per capita basis responsibility, India ranks pretty low. given that history of emissions. In terms of current emissions, India ranks number 3 after China and the United States. But the short answer is that India is not directly responsible for what it's suffering from right now.
In terms of aggregate emissions, Mike, I mean, still not in terms of per capita emissions, even now, right?
No.
And I would underscore that at the current rate of increase of emissions, that we're adding about 0.13 to 0.15 degrees Celsius per decade, which is, making every tenth of a degree makes matters worse and worse and worse in terms of the impacts. Anthony, do you want to have some closing words here?
You mean for the whole panel, or?
No. Any response to this question, jump in if you feel like it.
Well, I think that I can say both, maybe with situating it anecdotally and then kind of zooming out a little bit, because I think part of what I was, I think the reason I was asked to do this kind of what we can learn from Ganga and foregrounding kind of the MUDSKIPPER was, I think the ways in which also we can read the very large and the very small. So is there a way in which the small can actually tell us a great deal about how maybe we adapt to these kind of seemingly larger than life looming conditions? And I think that the intelligence with which people do adaptation along the Sangam is just an incredibly powerful way that I think other places could learn from as a kind of exportable analytic with respect to not just design, but I think the way in which material, culture, and social relationships, politics, go together with one another, and I think add up to something greater than the sum of their parts, I hope.
Thanks very much. And so I don't want to overdo your analogy, but sometimes academics meeting folks from we often operate in silos, and academics interacting with other groups is sometimes a bit like a fish out of water. But I think that today we've demonstrated how the Institute can pull together individuals more in the MUDSKIPPER category than in the others, working across these different boundaries to discuss these and to work on these important issues. So thank you very much, Mike and Sheila and Anthony, for this panel, and we look forward to the rest of this session.